I truly believe that it should change our attitude and our view of Islam. Because we have stories in the Buddhist tradition which really put Islam in a bad light. That is, that they came smashing into the north of India, destroyed Nalanda, chased people up to Tibet, warlike, etc., etc. However, when we look at the maritime areas that we are dealing with, that was not the story at all. These invasions which took place are real. I don't deny them. That they were probably destructive beyond measure, yes, I don't deny either. But what happened is, when the Srivijaya kingdom came to an end, it left a kind of vacuum throughout all those islands and coastal areas of Southeast Asia. And into that vacuum stepped not so much Arabs as Gujarati. It was the Gujarati merchants who had been converted to Islam, who became and took over the trade that was being left behind from the end of the Srivijaya kingdom. In other words, if you look at the spread of Islam, where you have the largest number of Islamic followers, after all, it was done through trade. It was not done through war. This part of that Islamic vision is quite different than the one that we see. Now, of course, it also meant that wherever the Indian merchants ceased to be the ones who ran the trade, Buddhism disappears. They had no support from the merchants. It was the trading people who were most successful, and it was these Gujaratis. You know, from DNA, we know that, for example, the DNA of Islamic peoples around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, Madagascar, and other places, don't show any female DNA from the Arabian Peninsula. They went as bachelors. They married where they went. They didn't take families with them. It was quite a different cultural pattern. These young men who were trading went out there and found their wives wherever they traded, and the DNA shows that. So I'm just trying to say that we need to review a little bit of our idea about Islam. Now, we have a second part to our project. The second part is that we want to do a 3D virtual reality installation for museums and other institutions. This work is primarily being done through the University of New South Wales in Australia, City University of Hong Kong, and the École Polytechnique Fédérale of Lausanne. I like to show pictures of these places. ECI, the one that called Cultural Atlas, where I work, is of course in South Hall in the Berkeley campus. It's the oldest building on campus. So when you look at it compared to these other fantastic modern structures of our partners, we are really old-fashioned and left behind in the dust. I'd love to show this just to show that we have partners who are truly in the forefront. This project of making 3D virtual reality is done with a special camera. The camera has two lenses. One is faced behind the other, like our eyes, and it turns 360 degrees and takes something like 1,100 images, analog images, while it does that, and it itself pieces it all together so that it gives you a continuous image. And then we also record ambient sound. That is, we just record the sounds of the place where we are. And in Sri Lanka, we got some fantastic recordings of the morning birds. When you do this kind of filming, I found out how hard it is. You get up at 3:30 in the morning. You've got to be out there and at the site before it's open to the public. You're filming till about 10 o'clock, and then you take a break, and then you come back at sunset, so you get the light for the sunset. It's very hard work. In fact, I got so tired from all this, I came back with pneumonia and went immediately to the hospital, and I'm still recovering from my time in Sri Lanka. I loved it, but it was tough. It's tough. What we want to do is, with this technology, and I thought we were really in the forefront. Well, it turns out that we are at the very end of this technology. These cameras, which are fantastic, they take pixel density like nothing that any of us have ever seen before, but it was a failure as a business venture. They only sold 4 of these cameras. Each one costs about $1 million, and they could only sell 4. We have access to 2 of them for the work that we are doing. However, Fuji in Japan has said, enough. We have stopped making the film. So we have been out going around the world looking for this film, what's left in the world. Recently found a whole lot of it in Norway. Off we sent to Norway to buy it up. So I think at this point we probably own most of the remaining film that's left for these cameras. We just did the Sri Lankan filming. It took 200 rolls, but then it's over, and we're having to develop new cameras. So we went to Switzerland and said, why don't you make this digital? How can you, instead of film, how about a digital? And they said, oh, sure. You just need to give us a $10 million euro check for us to start the research to do it. We slunk out of the door. So we want to do a 3D virtual reality exhibit so that you can follow the route in a 3D virtual experience. This is the kind of thing where it pieces it all together. These are actually 360-degree films. We've done, when we go into filming, we just take the time for this to do its work. Even developing the film that's left is a difficult thing. There's only one place in Japan that will do it. So we have to, like we did the work in Sri Lanka, we had to send it on with one of our team members to stop in Singapore, hand it over to somebody who would take it to Tokyo immediately so that it would not be ruined by heat, humidity, other things. So it's been a very difficult process to try to get really good film. But it's creating imagery for these places, which is unlike any imagery I think that exists right now for them when we have done with these cameras. This next round we will do Thailand, India, and we're hoping to continue. We've done Borobudur now in this form, which is going to be really nice. Our hope is that when it's finished, we will do, we have 3 places that have already signed up to have the installation. It will be, it's a circular room. You go in with the glasses. You have the experience of being there. So it'll go to the Maritime Museum in Hong Kong first, and also to the Maritime National Maritime Museum in Sydney, and to the Palace Museum Southern Branch in Taiwan. These are the 3 places, and we also have a number of other places in which we're negotiating. Now, I hope it's going to work. I'd like to this show, to close out my part of it, I'd like to see if it works, a film of what this looks like. What I'm showing you is what Sarah Kinderdine did for the Pure Land Cave at Dunhuang. And some of you may have seen something similar, or there are a number of things that have been done similar to this, but I think that what she did with that is one of the most outstanding things. They recently took it to the Freer Gallery in Washington. And I have to tell you that not everybody wanted it at the Freer Gallery because they said it's not artifacts. We show objects. This is a movie. We're not interested. However, they took it because they were offered a lot of money. However, the Washington Post gave it a front page, really rave review, and said for the first time, digital 3D has become a real thing which you can learn from. So from that point on, for the short period that they allowed it to appear at the Freer, they had people lined up for blocks waiting to get in to see the show. It was one of the most attended shows the Freer Gallery has ever had. So let's see if I could do this next one. Yeah. This is Sarah Kinderdine, and this is in the 3D room that we will do. She's showing what it's like to go to Dunhuang now. You go into a cave, a guide goes with you with a very low density flashlight, and that's all you see. With this one, you're allowed to film it in bright light, and then you put a magnifying glass on it, and you can see, because of the density, you can go down to a crack in the wall if you want. That's why this camera that we're using is so wonderful. The other thing that we can do with this is to change and recolor, try to get back to the original hint. We can also do things like this where you can animate it. This has sound, but I'm not playing it at this moment. We got the dancers at Beijing Institute of Ancient Dance using the computerization of their body movements, and then you transfer this over to the image so that you have this. So this is what we're planning for the future, and I hope that sometime, we can bring that installation to our own country here. It's been a huge project. As I said, we have more than 100 people involved in it. I'm really a small cog in this wheel, I can tell you that. And I discovered that I'm a weak cog because I can't keep up with this filming. I have to let the youngsters do that in the future. But I can tell you that we believe that what we are doing is really a necessary part of the study of Buddhism. And that by doing this, we are allowing people to re-look at its history, how it spread, and we would like to really make this public. So that's why we're doing the 3D installation, to take our information so that people can perhaps understand it because they will enjoy it. They will be able to take the journey from the Mediterranean, down the Nile, from place to place, and go in and see in great detail in certain sites, just as you saw. So thank you very much.
I'm curious whether you initiated this whole project at Cal and where you got all the people and funding.
Yes, basically we did start it. I started the project. We got funding from a number of places. The funding for the filming that we've done, we got from the Australia Research Council. They gave us, and from the Maritime Museums. We've spent about $600,000 on the filming so far. It's very expensive. We're always out with our begging bowls. Sarah Kenderdine, my partner in crime here, has just moved to Lausanne in Switzerland. So we're changing some of our outreach to be working in the EU from now on, as well as continuing our activities with our Asian group. But it's very expensive, but it's exciting, and we're hoping that we can begin to have the installation ready for Hong Kong, maybe early 2019.
Thank you, that was fascinating. One question, and before the rise of Islam, what prevented Buddhism from spreading west? Sea routes went that way, so why didn't Buddhism take off in the Middle East and West Asia?
Yes, it's a good question. It's one that has haunted all of us for a long time. Once we understand the routes, I showed you the great circle of Buddhism. That's where Buddhism was really active. And when you go outside that great circle, it falls off very fast. Sometimes what I show for the great circle is the actual extent to which you find any Buddhist activity. The Arab traders who were coming across trading with Rome, there were that many Indians who did it. Hardly any, really. It was mainly Arabs. They were not involved, of course, with Buddhism, nor was it a part of what they wanted to do. When it spread from there up on the Silk Road, it didn't necessarily come across from Eurasia, but I think the main thrust of power that was going up through the Silk Road, so-called Silk Road through Inner Asia, was coming from the western ports of India. And that's where the force of the trade went. But as you know, if you bypass a place, it can just disappear. I sometimes show a picture of Detroit. Have any of you seen what Detroit looks like these days? It's a downtown island of high-rise buildings surrounded by open fields where they have torn down all the houses because the population dropped. And it's trade. Automobile trade changed. And if there's no money and you change the trade or you change the route, then places just dry up and disappear. And they can do it rather rapidly.
The question I have is, it's very exciting, I think, this virtual project you're doing. Where did you film in Sri Lanka?
Oh, we had, we chose 14 sites, and we filmed at those sites. The decision on which sites to use, we usually try to leave to local people if we can. So the sites that were chosen by the Institute of Archaeology at Perandia University.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for enlightening us, Professor Lancaster. You mentioned about that Buddhism sort of a little bit different when it went into Guangzhou, China. My question is, what's the relationship between that Buddhism and the influence of Chinese Taoism with it?
Well, of course, in terms of Buddhism in any place, it has to adapt itself to its local environment, as all religions do. So, of course, Buddhism and Taoism have existed side by side. The relationship between them is really, I have to say, not well known still. It's very complicated and complex, and that's primarily because you're either a Buddhist scholar or a Taoist scholar, and we don't talk to each other. And that's pretty much the way it's been. But of course, the Taoist elements of Buddhism as it forms, how much of a role that's going to play with our final thing depends on our teams. And thus far, most of the teams that are working are limiting themselves to Buddhist data, I have to say. May not be a good idea, but you raised a good point.
Thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic lecture. And I wanted to ask you a question about the map, the Maritime Buddhism map that you showed, especially regarding the location of the Buddhist sites in South India. I noticed that all of the sites are on the east coast of South India, even though we know that maritime trade was very much focused around Mussooris and the west part of South India. Does that tie in with this, in what you just said earlier about the spread of Buddhism in one direction and not in the other?
India is a very interesting place because rivers, as you know, all the big rivers flow to the east. Because of the mountains, there is a very thin line on the west coast. And it changes the way Indian culture developed enormously. So the real fact that you follow those rivers as they go from the mountains toward the east is where you'll find a lot of the Buddhist and trade activity. While it is true that these early people had to land on the west coast, very soon they were turning the corner. They were going around Sri Lanka, and they were going up the east coast of India, because that opened up then all the Andaman Sea area and all the Spice Islands and China, and so it's complex, but as you look and study it, it begins to have a pattern.
Well, I guess I take this break, I will ask a question since I have the mic. So you mentioned that ancient copper town in Sri Lanka, the one you find the inscription on top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And so the description without reading, being a Chinese, I would think it's a Mazu,
Well,
which is Guanyin anyway.
sure.
Yeah. So my question is that the concept actually coming back from China, or actually is that the concept went to China?
No, I think that Avalokiteshvara and the sea comes from South India or from India. And Sri Lanka. Because if you go, and this has been pointed out by some of the people sitting here, if you go to the mouth of rivers, you're going to find images of Avalokiteshvara because he was the god of the sea. And that is not a borrowing from the Chinese. When he gets to Guangzhou and onto the coast of China, I think that's when the gender change occurs into Guanyin as a female. And that you'll never understand why Guanyin is the female manifestation of Avalokiteshvara until you deal with the sea. It has to do with that. And after all, if you go to the major site for Guanyin, where is it? It's Puto. And what is that? It's an island. And what is the major thing that they say about it? It's that she protects sailors. But so did Tara. Tara in India and Tibet protected sailors. You'd be surprised, why would the Tibetans want to protect sailors with Tara? But in their text, we'll find it, that she was a protector of sailors. So all of this works together to try to see the dynamics that led up to the so-called gender switch.
So I'm totally convinced. I was convinced last time about the sea routes when you spoke here. So I don't know who these sea deniers are. That's fake news. But my question to you, there's sort of combined questions, is that my understanding, the reason why Buddhism never traveled into Persia was because they had a very strong state religion in Zoroastrianism. And so they basically kept out foreign religious programs by doing that. But I also noticed you had 2 little red dots in Egypt, and I wondered what those were, or unless I was hallucinating.
Well, we felt that for part of our story, we have to show what was happening on the Nile and the fact that these ships were coming from India and going over and touching there. So part of the story is to look to see that extension. If you look in the Greek literature, there are only 2 early examples of the mention of Buddhism in 2nd century and 4th century. Both of those, though, are really mention of Indians in Alexandria, not in Greece proper. Alexandria would have understood and known a lot about India compared to the rest of the Mediterranean world because they were in much contact. So there's a lot still to be done in that regard, and that's why the 2 dots are there. Just not that we're saying there was Buddhism there, but that somehow it relates to the whole story that we're trying to tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. One of the slides that you showed was the slide of a fabulous cave in Myanmar, and was wondering if you could tell me where that cave is located.
I don't have the, trying to think myself. It's most of what it's up the Irrawaddy toward the north there. Goes a little bit toward the northeast. I wasn't with them when they went there, and my map right now is not focusing in my Google map mind. But there are fantastic sites in Myanmar, many as there are in almost every country. Our task is to try to figure out how we take a site and connect it with these others. So just to tell you a little bit about methodology with regard to this, I am working on an article, long overdue, on the 4 sacred mountains of Buddhism in China. And in working on that article, it's given me an idea about our ports, and that is, you can go to each mountain and have all this data about that mountain. But the minute you see the 4 mountains as part of a system, and you put them together, all the data shifts. So the 4 mountains as a system are very different than the 4 mountains as 4 distinct districts. And that's what we find with like the famous cave that I showed in in Myanmar. When you work with a local site, it has one meaning. But with our atlas, if we try to tie these together in a whole system that relates to Buddhism in many different places, it changes the data on every single site that we have. That's part of it. So we can go and pick up an individual district, but we feel like we're putting it into a different format.
Well, actually, then I can ask another question, I guess, if you're all quiet. Could you elaborate more on the horse trade?
Well, the best horses, of course, are always going to come from grasslands. Because horses take a lot of grass. You know, and if you have a mounted army, you know, they have to stop periodically and let the horses eat. And the horses have to eat a lot of grass to go on. So the grasslands of Central Asia, of course, was a homeland of horses, and that's the place where people first domesticated them, I think, and that's where the strongest and the best horses could be found. So when you think about driving them by land, that would be a really big task. You know, in our cowboy movies of the past, they used to herd the cattle and take them to the railhead to ship them off to Chicago. And the big problem was, how far do you herd cattle? Because if you herd them for a long distance, they get thinner and thinner and thinner. So you start off with really fat cows, and if you take them too far without, et cetera. So to take the horses by land to China, in terms of what would you feed them? How would you keep them healthy? So they put them on boats to some degree, and they started floating down the Ganges. Whenever they could get them across the mountains and onto the boats, then they could feed them, they could keep them, and they arrived in China still fat and healthy. That seems to have been the reason they did it. It just came as a surprise to me that you would do that. But it was big trade. It was big time trade, and at one time was one of the major forms of trade between Vietnam and any other country was their passage of horses from Central Asia into China.
For the installations that you're doing at the different museums, I'm here. How do you plan to configure them? Is it going to be a journey of one person visiting different sites? Will the sites be chronological? Are they geographical? How will you tell the story?
You've been listening in to our many, many meetings. How shall we do this? First of all, it has to be an experience where many people will have to look at the same thing. Because if you make it individual, it takes too long, and very few people can have the experience. On the other hand, we do think that we will have downloads available with QR codes, so people who would like to download the data into their own phones or computers for any particular part that they would like, then they're going to have it in their own system and can spend time doing it. Or you can go onto the internet site and go in and spend the time reading and doing the things individually that you would like to do. It would be wonderful to have the other experience. We've tried to think how to do it, and we're still considering some possibilities of having another room where people could go in and have their own computer to play with and see what they want to see. It's just a matter of logistics. As nice as it would be to let everybody see what they want to see, But I don't think that people want to put on headgears. That would be the only way to do it. Everybody would have their own headgear, but I don't know if you've worn the 3D headgear. It's not so comfortable. So it's a good problem. We haven't solved it yet, but I suspect that people will have to share the experience when they're in.
We have time for one last question.
Okay, I'm back. I'm over here. I'm back on the horses.
All right.
And I'm gathering that the ship trade was very close to the coast. That is, they did not go far out into sea, because horses don't do well on ships.
Mm-hmm.
You lose a lot of them because they don't have the reflux, and they choke on their own vomit if they get seasick. So does that mean that it was very much a coastal trade?
Well, there were two very definite types of trade. One is where the sailing circuits that were done were just one-day circuits. You sailed out to get the fish and then you go home. Or if you set out across the open sea, which they actually were doing in some cases, that's a different kind of trade, and that's what happened with from Palembang to Guangzhou. When they made that open sea route, and they didn't go along the coastline, then a place like Akio just dries up.
But what about the horses? I mean, how could they last? They're not seafaring creatures, right?
Yeah, I don't really have an answer to that, because so far the data hasn't talked about it specifically as to how they control the horses in there.
Because that's my understanding is that's why the British had such a hard time taking horses to India.
Yeah.
They didn't last on
So
the
it
ships.
probably is the case that they would have hugged the coastline, or they've done whatever would be the smoothest ride. You're probably right. Yeah.
Well, I guess actually we do have time for one more question. This is truly the last question.
This isn't truly a question, but thank you, Dr. Lancaster, for a brilliant lecture. Last summer at the Getty Museum, the exhibition about Dunhuang did have that 3D experience, which I attended. And I have to say, it was absolutely fabulous. It was a small room. We had 3D glasses, but it was totally immersive, and really being to experience that you were in that place. So I hope that will be a component in your exhibitions.
So do we.
Just wanted to share that.
Yes, that was similar to the one that I showed.
Yeah. So thank everybody, and thank